Hey guys, this is Kris Jones for episode 31 of Ask Me Anything. Today I am going to deliver my very first book review of a book that I just completed earlier this week. It's called Unshakeable by Tony Robbins. He wrote that book with a financial expert by the name of Peter Mallouk. I've pretty much, as you guys know, I've read all of Tony's stuff. I've done most of his tape series. I've gone to 17 events. And, there really is not, in my opinion, a single greater mentor for personal and professional development than Tony. There's a lot of people out there that think he's just this self-help guru, that somehow he just wants us all to think positive and our lives will get better. In fact, he makes it very clear that that isn't how he thinks. Thinking positive is great. Being positive and optimistic is really a good start. But he always uses the analogy of a garden with weeds. He said, if you think you can tell yourself there's no weeds in your garden, you're lying to yourself. Go pick the weeds so you have no weeds in your garden. So he's very instructional, he's very process-oriented. And he really peels back the onion in terms of just growth, personal and professional growth. One area that he's become very well known for in the last couple years, he wrote a book about a year or two ago that became a New York Times bestseller. In fact, it's the best-selling financial book of the last decade. And he just followed it up with Unshakeable. But again, how do we become more wealthy? And I'm going to actually talk to you about what probably comes to your mind first when I say wealth. You think about financial success. Tony defines it much more broadly, and there's a chapter in this book that honestly is a game changer from the standpoint of putting into perspective what wealth really is beyond money. But I'm going to share with you just 5 takeaways from this book that I think resonate with me. I took copious notes like I always do when I'm learning. As I've shared with you guys, I'm an active learner, not a passive learner. I don't really think learning takes place when you're being passive. Think about it. Back when we were in college or high school or whatever, those times where we just sat in class, and when the class was over, we had no idea what the teacher was talking about. That's passive learning. Active learning is actually listening and taking notes. If you're watching a video, it's rewinding the video. If it's a book, it's doing this, which is, underlining. It's this, it's taking notes within the book. So anyway, I took a sort of active role, but there were 5 things that I want to share with you guys in terms of, if you will, a book review. So I told you guys this in it was like AMA number 18 or so, where I talked about how my grandfather sat me down when I was a teenager, and he challenged me to think outside of the way most people think about accumulating wealth. And he really focused on this idea of discipline. So in other words, you could become a millionaire by never making a huge paycheck in your life, but by being disciplined. And so Tony, similarly, and not ironically, agrees that creating wealth comes down to discipline and managing emotion or psychology by knowing the truth about investing. This is one of those books that, he's incredibly critical of the financial industry. He takes a fairly negative approach to how most wealth managers and how most money managers function in terms of conflicts of interest and other things. But 5 takeaways. The first one is you cannot sell out. You need to what he calls rebalance. So there are downturns in the stock market. They're referred to as corrections or bear markets. But downturns in the market, if you look at since the stock market was created, downturns have always been 100% of the time followed by upturns. 80% of the corrections, a correction is being defined as when the market corrects by less than 10%. So if the S&P is at 20,000, it goes down less than 200 points. Most of them, about 80% of them, don't turn into a bear market. So in other words, you've got to stay in the market. You can't sell out, because then if you do that, you're getting into the business of sort of trying to predict the market. And he provides a tremendous amount of information in this book that is a losing battle, trying to pick individual stocks, which I'll get to, and trying to predict how the market's going to go. So he provides a lot of statistics and a lot of evidence to suggest that you need to stay in the market. You can't sell out. Couple things that I jotted down in my notes that I want to share with you guys. From 1996 through 2015, the S&P 500, which is an index of some of the best companies in America, that returned an average of 8.2% a year. But if you missed out on only 10 of the best trading days during those 20 years, your returns dwindled down to 4.5% per year. So instead of 8.2%, 4.5%. In other words, your returns are cut in almost half by selling out of the market when it's going down, by you trying to predict that a correction is going to turn into a bear market. Again, his argument is that's futile. You've got to be in it for the long haul. Investing is about accumulating wealth and allowing that interest to compound over time, which I'll get to again in a second. But nonetheless, you got to stay in the market. Remember that wealth is created through discipline and psychology. It's counterintuitive, right? Don't you think we need to be refreshing our stock tickers and trying to predict when that next downturn is going to come? The answer is no. The body of evidence that he presents in this book would suggest otherwise. So, in short, you and I are not smart enough to predict the market consistently or accurately. So therefore, we need to stay in it. Another way of looking at it, which he stresses, and he uses this concept called rebalancing, which is downturns in the market are actually buying opportunities. They're not an opportunity to get emotional and sell low. So rebalancing is when, I'm going to get to this idea of diversification in just a couple of minutes, but when you have a diversified portfolio, inevitably a portion of that portfolio is in safe haven. It's in bonds or something that won't respond the same way a stock market would. So that money is protected. So if your stocks go down and you have 20% of your capital allocated into bonds, you could sell some of those bonds to buy stock to rebalance your overall portfolio. Something to keep in mind. The second takeaway, I mentioned this briefly when I told you guys about my grandfather in a previous AMA. Tony calls it his freedom fund. The freedom fund is when you and I and everyone, there are no excuses here. It doesn't matter how big your paycheck is. Seriously, it does not matter how big your paycheck is. Remember, how big your paycheck is not going to be the determinant of whether or not you're going to become a millionaire or not. It's going to be through discipline and compounding interest. But his freedom fund is taking 10 to 20% of every single paycheck, starting right now, and investing in the stock market. Takeaway number 3, you can become a millionaire by allowing your money to compound over time. For instance, if you're just 30 years old and you invest $10,000 today, collecting 9% per year for 20 years, that same $10,000 investment will grow to nearly $300,000. So if you could just figure out a way this year of putting $10,000 away and allowing it to sit for 20 years at about a 9% interest rate, so it will compound over those years, it'll turn into $300,000. It doesn't take too much for you to start doing some mental gymnastics and some mental math to figure out that if you're able somehow miraculously this year, within the next couple of years, to stow away $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, how you could become a millionaire by the time you're 50, if you're only 30 years old. If you're 20, you could be a millionaire when you're in your 40s. He gives a lot of examples and scenarios and storylines of how powerful compounding is. But guess what, folks? Compounding doesn't work on zero. I always say to my kids all the time, multiply, when they'll ask me for something, I'll say, sure, multiply your favorite number by 0. Answer is 0. So you need a freedom fund. You need to start investing some capital in order for it to grow over time. So takeaway number 4. This is, I mentioned earlier to you that part of, Tony's book is a real critical and transparent analysis of the financial services industry. And the takeaway is to be careful of the fees you pay to money managers and for mutual funds, who tend to, by the way, underperform index funds. So mutual funds, there's a ton of evidence to suggest that most of them underperform an index fund. Yet, they charge you a fee to access them that's double or even triple what it costs to enter an index fund. So again, index funds are available to anyone. You could buy them through any trading account, E-Trade or Scottrade or whatever, like an S&P 500 index fund, just as an example. That's Tony's favorite. It's my favorite as well. But so mutual funds charge high fees, and they underperform the market. If your money's invested in mutual funds, I encourage you to read this book and do some more research, because over time, you're going to end up with a lot less when you need it, or when you're ready to retire, or you're ready to take out some money to buy a new home or buy a second home or whatever. So be very, very careful. And in most cases, you're paying too much. The same exists, I have some of my best friends are wealth managers. They work for Merrill Lynch, or they work for, Bank of America, or any of these companies, right? These are good people. The problem is that they tend to charge you more than they should be. And the other point, they could charge you as much as 2% or more. And Tony says, as a general rule, you should never pay cumulatively from both entering an index fund and a money manager more than, say, 1%, 1.25% at the absolute most. So if the money manager, the wealth manager, is charging you 2%, and then he or she puts you into a mutual fund that charges you another 1 to 2%, now you're at 3 to 4% of your principal every year, not going into compounding. Think about it. What I just shared with you about compounding at 9%. What if you're paying 4% of that 9%, if it's going out, your compound factor is only 5%, not 9%. So be very, very careful. He also mentions another thing where if you have some wealth and you don't really pay attention to it, you need to pay attention to me right now, which is, it sounds crazy that this still goes on today, but a lot of wealth managers work for these big organizations that also have their own funds. So they're like double dipping or triple dipping. And what the companies they work for will do is actually commission them, incentivize them to push a particular fund. Here's the problem. Most of them are mutual funds, and most of them underperform index funds. They just underperform the market. It's like a single, double, triple whammy. So you add on the excess fees of your mutual fund, you add on what tends to be extreme pricing from most wealth managers, and then you add in the conflict of interest that they're making additional money by pushing a mutual fund that underperforms the market. You just need to be very, very careful. I am not a cup is half empty kind of dude. I also don't like to spend a lot of time focusing on negativity. However, some of the stuff he shares in the book is revealing and startling, and you should be aware of it, because I want you to have more money when you need it later on. And I think that's the same reason he shares it, for sure. So finally, I mentioned diversification. This is, if there's no other reason to buy this book, it's to relearn and rehear. Remember, repetition is the mother of learning. That diversification is important. But the way that he thinks about diversification, I like. It's different than I've learned in the past. First, he does not believe in individual stock picking. He just doesn't. The vast majority of evidence says that individual stock pickers lose. And listen, I love Google, I love Facebook, I think Snapchat's going up, all this stuff, but the volatility in that, the risk of that is not recommended in the book. Instead, he says diversification, primarily with index funds, so across index funds, S&P 500, small cap, large cap, technology, energy, among other things. That's index diversification. Remember, the index funds are going to be the ones with the lowest cost. And an index fund is really similar to a mutual fund. It's a bucket of all of the stocks within that particular index. So it really does provide a broad diversification within that index, though. Remember, an S&P 500 is not a technology index. It's basically an index of America's top companies. There are some tech companies in there, but if you want to have some exposure to tech, you can invest in a technology index. So again, diversification in index funds, and then two, which is really interesting, geographical. So geography. And that's a hard one for me. That's a hard pill to swallow because I am definitely a believer that the American stock market is going to, is going to perform greater than the other leading stock markets in the world. The problem with my analysis, though, is that won't always be the case. And diversification is really about protecting you when what you think is going to happen doesn't happen. And one way of getting that exposure to diversification is by investing in other countries. Consider that when you're thinking about making an investment. So this is a very easy book to read. I was trying to, I'm not sure if it's an entry-level book, a moderate-level book, or an advanced book. I've been, as you guys know, studying finance since I was a teenager. I opened a Roth IRA at the request of my grandfather at like 19 years old. So I don't know. It was easy for me to read. I think it'll be easy for you to read. It was meant for the populace. I know that when Tony writes a book, he wants it to connect with as many people as possible. So I highly recommend you guys get this. If you've read this already, go ahead in the comments and share with me some of the insights that you took from it. I only shared 5 takeaways. There's a lot of meat in this book. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to get it. I encourage you to get it and share with me privately or via comments, what your thoughts are. One thing that I'm very proud of over the course of the last 20 years of my life is how consistent I've stayed behind Tony Robbins. And as a result, how many people who trust me have taken my advice to consume some of his content. And one of the most precious things about my success are those moments of private time with a friend who thanks me. Just looking here, come back into the camera, you'll see this was given to me by a really close friend of mine, Luke Matthews. It says, "Life will never be the same." That was written in coal when I sent him to an Unleash the Power Within in San Jose, California. That's a Tony Robbins conference. Luke Matthews walked on a hotbed of coals. Somehow he got a piece of that coal and wrote me this note and framed it for me. It's those, and I've really never shared that. I have it here in my loft, but so take my advice on this one. Get the book. Let it impact you. Take from it what you will to make your life better. And ultimately, my goal for you, regardless of how much income you make, is to put you in a position where you feel financial security and you feel like your life is on your terms, not someone else's. I'll see you guys for AMA number 32.